get my 6. People often ask, hey, Crazy Lake, what exactly are you drinking out of that mug when you tell these crazy stories? Well, today, because I already just had my coffee, we're going with water. Gotta stay hydrated. All right, so act as if this cup said, first, I'm gonna drink this water, then I'm gonna go find Bigfoot, Sasquatch. Imagine it said Sasquatch on there as well, okay? So people wanna know, and it's a good thing that today it's water, because I'll tell you, when I sip coffee on here, a lot of people just lose their minds. I don't understand it. Regularly, somebody will say, drink coffee on your own time, not while you're making your videos. That's selfish and rude. Isn't this my time? So anyway, I did him a favor today. I drank coffee down there at the house. I'm gonna drink water while I tell this story. So maybe 2 weeks or so ago, maybe 3 weeks or so ago, I made a video where I talked about how I'd run into an old college buddy at Costco of all places. That was the story about the witch. And a lot of people are watching it and coming around to the channel for that. Just within the last couple of days, I was talking to that old buddy again. We're doing a lot of catching up. And we've gotten to the point where we've pretty much caught up, you know, with each other as far as what I've been doing the last quarter of a century since I saw him and vice versa. So we're at the point now to where we're just asking questions about so-and-so. Where's so-and-so? Whatever happened to so-and-so? Oh, you know, so-and-so's doing great. He's married. He's selling insurance. You know, he never made it to the NFL, but he's a pretty good insuranceman. He's made a pretty good life for himself. Unfortunately, you hear of so many that are no longer with us. They've passed on. And today's story, case in point, showcases one such individual. Now, he went by a nickname. I'm not going to say his real name because he probably still has family in the area. And there's probably some stories that they would not want to have told. So I'm going to be skirting around a lot of specifics. But you're going to understand in the full enormity the story in its entirety. Yeah, make sure you keep looking back there. There's been some interesting characters potentially caught in some of these videos lately. So the man's nickname was Blue. Yeah, like, you know, the dog and where the red fern grows, I think they had old Blue. Well, I asked him once when I was talking to him how he got that nickname, and he said it was because of his eyes. They were the shade of blue, almost like this shirt. And he would have been from the same generation as Frank Sinatra. A lot of you folks are a little bit older than me. A lot of folks of all ages, of course, know who Frank Sinatra was, and you'll remember that they called him Old Blue Eyes. Well, that's about as far as it went, as far as any semblance to Frank Sinatra with Old Blue, the man in our story today. Because if, you know, those baby blue eyes of his were the beginning of his attractiveness, they were also the end. He was kind of grumpy, curmudgeon-y, and scared of something. If I look back on it now, you know, we've talked here on this channel before about empaths, people who can almost see other people's emotions just seeping out of their pores. I just always got the feeling when I was around Old Blue that what was seeping out of his pores was regret and remorse. But it was, a lot of folks wouldn't have anything to do with him because he was grumpy and mean and crotchety, like I've said. I finally parted ways with him once I found out that, I'm just going to say it like it is, he was an old racist. And once I caught wind of that, that was just, hey, I've never minded being like a sympathetic shoulder, maybe for somebody to, or to be a sounding board for people to kind of vent and let it out. But that's a line where I draw the line. And so I exited this guy's company. Before I knew this about him, I would see him in town, small little burg where we went to college. And it was the oddest thing because he rented like this nasty, crappy rat hole of an apartment in town because he didn't like staying on his farm. He had a farm about 12 miles out of town. He had a couple hundred acres. And he had raised and sold cattle for most of his life. The people in the area who knew him to be very wealthy, very affluent, but he was one of these skinflint types. Wouldn't spend his money. As a matter of fact, when I was knowing him, he was probably pushing 80. He was in his 70s, pushing 80. And he would buy like, you know, the bread delivery guys and girls that come to the stores and they stock up with the bread and the snack cakes, the brownies, the Twinkies, the Ho-Hos and all this stuff. Oh, I had to say Twinkies. Well, he'd get them after they passed their expiration date. So as he'd take them off the shelves, you know, he'd take them away in his truck. And old Blue was always there to meet him every morning at this one small country store where he went in and stocked every morning. Because like most farmers, old Blue was up before the sun every day and went down with it for bed. So he would try to get these cakes off the guy, and the guy said, well, I can't just give them to you. I'll get fired, but I'll sell them to you for $0.25. They usually sold for $1. So old Blue would give him $0.25 for these boxes of snack cakes, and then he'd sell them to us as college kids for 50 cents. So we were still getting them half off. He was doubling his money. Percentage-wise, it's good business, but, I mean, he couldn't have been making but maybe $10 a day at most because, you know, you'd see him walking down the street, he'd have an armful of, because it was never a whole lot, but I guess it kept his mind sharp. It made him feel like, you know, maybe he still had value. That sounded like a pretty distinct tree knock coming from back there somewhere. But he was always gruff, and he'd kind of give you a rash. And, but I would linger, I would talk to him, and just small talk, never anything big. But one summer, I got to know him quite well, and towards the end of the summer is when I found out he was a racist, and I never had anything to do with him again. I went to summer school one summer term, and there was like hardly anybody going to summer school. It was a very small college. And he would always be sitting on this bench in town in front of this store where he rented an apartment out behind it. And I'd just stop and I'd talk to him, and he'd tell me stories about raising cattle and all these things. And I'd always ask him about his farm. I'm like, why don't you want to go out to your farm? Why do you stay in this little rat hole apartment back here? You know, people told me you're rich. You got this 200-acre farm. Why don't you want to go out there? And he said, you know, he's alone. His wife's been dead for many years. His children were grown and gone and never came to see him. I mean, he was just a grumpy old bastard. I would imagine probably not a whole lot of people came to see him. But he used to say there's just too many ghosts. There's just too many ghosts out there on that farm, and he didn't want to see them. He didn't want to hear them. And I thought, you know, what he means by this is memories. Maybe once upon a time, he had a good relationship with his wife. Maybe he had a good relationship with his children that won't talk to him now because he's such a crotchety, hateful old bastard. But it wasn't memories of better days. It was literally ghosts. Because towards the end of that summer, he told me a tale about a tree. A big oak tree, not unlike this big giant red oak here behind me, on his farm, where he and some of his friends carried out some very bad things. They did some bad things. He never came right out and specifically said what they were, but I prodded and I prodded and I prodded. And he said, what I'll tell you is there are certain people that went missing that were never found and they never will be found. And they perished hanging from that tree. And I prodded and I prodded and I prodded some more. And I asked, who were these individuals? I mean, and he explained, and he cried when he explained. He said it was the 1940s, late 1940s, 1950s. He said that there were folks starting to go to that small college that weren't from around there. These are his words, not mine. We weren't used to their kind, and we certainly weren't used to seeing them kissing our women. Well, I pretty much could read between those lines. And I kind of figured it out. And I politely excused myself from that old guy within minutes of having found that out. And I never spoke to him again, because that's just someone I would never want to spend time with. And I think most of you folks watching these videos know exactly what I'm getting at, and you wouldn't want to spend time with those people either. People like that. I'm not used to his kind. Hating somebody because of the difference of the color of their skin, their nationality, their ethnicity, their sexual preference, orientation, gender identification. Superficial things that people use to hate. The people that use any of those things to hate others are people I will not allow into my life. Period. And there's been times I've made friends with people throughout the years, like this old man, and it took me a while to catch on that that's the type of person they were. But once I did, they were no longer my friend. And I didn't have any sort of, I've never entered their presence again. So what's the point of all this? This old man that used to sell snack cakes that I have reason to believe may have been involved with some very nasty things 60, 70 years ago. Well, I asked my old friend that I've reconnected with here recently from college if he knew whatever happened to that old guy. And he said, yeah, actually I do. It's kind of an odd story, because he was asking somebody else about it just a few years back, and that's how he got word of the story. And let me point out, certainly not to justify anything this man did in his youth, because it's unjustifiable. What I will tell you is that day, the last day I talked to him, when he broke down, telling me some of those stories without being specific, he did cry real tears of remorse. And I truly believe he was looking back on some of the things he had done in his youth, and he was ashamed of it. He was just ashamed of it. So I will give him that, okay? Now, the story that my friend told me was that the story he heard is that that old man finally decided to move back to his farm just a few years after we left that place. And for some reason, and I hadn't told my friend this story, so he didn't know this. He didn't know about the man's past. But for some reason, he took it upon himself one day to get his chainsaw and go out there and cut down that red oak. And listen, I know right there you're saying, well, that's not believable. A man about 80 years old out there with a chainsaw doing that. Let me tell you about these country people. And I met one this summer at a birthday party. We went to a friend's birthday party. He was turning 60. His dad was there. His dad was 84. His dad, to this day, still cuts, splits, and stacks his own firewood. And he uses splitting mauls, sledgehammer, diamond mauls. He doesn't use a wood splitter. Some of these old guys have been doing this their whole life and never stopped doing it. They can still do it. As a matter of fact, when I met that guy this summer at the birthday party, we talked about this, because I've had people blast me on here. Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You won't be able to walk when you're, whatever, man. I've heard that said. When I was a runner in my youth, running 70 miles a week, you better stop that. You won't be able to walk when you're 30. Always banging your knees and your back and blah, blah, blah. I turned 50 in 2 years, and I'm on pace to be the fastest man over 50 in Central Virginia. It's because of this. Those who do can because they still do. Those who can't don't. Wait a minute. Or those who don't can't because they don't do anymore. They stop. And I talked about that with this man who was in his 80s, 84 years old. This summer I met at a party. I said, what do you think of that? He said, I think you're exactly right. He says he's going to be split and stacking his own firewood until the day he dies. And I said, sir, when was the last time you did that? 84 years old. He looked down, he thought about it, he looked right back up and he said, 4 days ago. And let me tell you, this isn't some dumb hillbilly. Even ironically, I shouldn't say that, it's going to sound bad now. Even though this gentleman actually was originally from West Virginia. He moved down here to Virginia when he was in high school. Okay, but hey, I'm from West by God, Virginia, and I don't consider myself a dumb hillbilly. It's a stereotype, okay? He wasn't some dumb southern redneck who grew up in Virginia. This man got 3 degrees from the University of Virginia, practiced in the medical field for 50 years, is one of the most educated, successful, self-made multimillionaires I've ever met. And at 84 years old, he's out here cutting, splitting, and stacking his own firewood. And the reason he can is because he does. And, you know, I meant to talk about that guy for several months, but it was apropos. It was appropriate at this time because he's, oh, there's no way an 80-something-year-old man was out there. Yeah. So he went out and he decided he was going to cut down that big, giant red oak tree, a place at which many terrible things took place in his youth. And he had it almost down, and he was cutting it perfect because the people that, you know, they hadn't seen or heard from him in a few days, they went out to check on him and they found him. They couldn't figure it out. He had cut that tree perfectly. The man had felled trees for probably 70 years of his life. And he had that tree being cut the exact way he needed it for it to fall away from him and not harm him in any way. But the thing kicked back on him and crushed him. And they found him under 20,000 pounds of 150-year-old red oak. Now, they said he would have died instantly. There was no way he would have laid there or suffer. I mean, it just crushed him. And they looked back, thinking back over the weather the previous days. You see, we got some wind here today. And when the wind's blowing, you got to be very careful because that can make those trees, there's a wind. You might think it's calm down here, but 50 feet up at the top of that tree, the wind might be something fierce and it can make that tree kick back. There were no winds that day, so they can't explain it. Knowing what I know about what took place at that tree, at the hands of him and his friends, I think it's pretty easy to explain. It all comes home to roost. See you for more next time.